Thank you for tuning into the Parkside Parent Podcast. I'm Robbie Lacey, the middle school pastor here at Parkside, and it is our mission in student and children's ministries to support families as we help unbelieving students become committed followers of Jesus Christ. Today on the podcast, we are excited to welcome back on Christopher Ash, who's going to help us answer the question, how does being a good spouse help me be a good parent?
Christopher, thank you again for joining us on the Parkside Parent Podcast. Welcome.
It's good to be with you again.
Well, we're just going to jump right into our question for this episode. I think one of the common experiences for many parents to find that their relationship with their spouse in their marriage tends to take on a new dimension when they have kids. So in the way that before you have kids, you can kind of just focus on your spouse and they kind of take up all of your time and your attention. For many, we find that time and attention that we're able to before devote only to our spouse is naturally, in many ways, rightly redirected towards the demands of parenting. And as kids grow up, there's a unique demand that comes with having small children, little toddlers. And as kids grow up, those demands evolve and change, and in most cases increase. And I think for many parents, the gravitational pull of focusing on our kids can lead to actually a lack of focus on your spouse. Balancing those priorities of family relationship can be really challenging. Do you have any advice for parents who are having trouble striking that balance, who maybe have allowed their kids to take up so much of their time and their attention that they've actually gotten to the point of, in many ways, neglecting their spouse?
Yeah, I think it's a very shrewd and perceptive question, Danny. I really do. The needs, when children are born, naturally, the needs of a newborn baby are immediate. They depend entirely on, well, particularly the mother, and it's urgent. You can't neglect them. You can't set them aside. Those who adopt children, they have tremendous needs, and it's right that there's this enormous investment of time and emotional energy and physical energy in raising them, and all of that is right. I think the danger is when we think I can put my relationship with my wife or my husband on hold. I can just press the pause button, and we'll pick that up again at some later stage when there's more time and energy. And that just doesn't come. It's really dangerous. The pause button can metamorphose into the stop button if you're not really careful. And I think it's helpful to remember that your kids, my kids, our kids will be watching because they live behind the same front door as us. They'll be watching the way mum and dad relate to one another. I'm assuming that mum and dad are together. Of course, they're not always, and that's a terrible sadness. But God's grace can break in there as well. But if mum and dad are together, they're watching, and they are learning far more than we sometimes think. They're watching dad, and they're saying to themselves, so this is how you're a dad. This is how you're a husband. So this is how you speak to your wife. You watch how dad speaks to mum and how he speaks about mum to other people. Does he praise and affirm and encourage her? Does he undermine her and say cutting, critical things? And they're watching mum, and they're thinking they may not be formulating it like this, but they'll be thinking, this is what Christ-like Christian submission looks like. Mm-hmm. It's a mum who's a capable, energetic, hardworking, serving mum. And she understands something of the Bible pattern of husband and wife. And they watch that, and at its best, they think, this is wonderful. And then if in due course they marry and have kids, they will be much more likely to build a marriage shaped on that. We're much more shaped by our parents' marriages than we sometimes like to think. So it's really, really important. And I think there are ways in which it can be guarded. There are ways in which children can often be trained to give mum and dad space. It may be evenings when the kids are very young. It may be getting a sort of alpha plus babysitter to come and stay for a night or two so mum and dad can go away for a break. We used to try and do that. Sometimes just 24 hours. We used to try and do that once a year. It was valuable out of all proportion to the time. And so I don't know if our kids did understand how we love each other, but I hope they did.
Yeah, that's so helpful. And I love the way that you point to the fact that loving your spouse is actually a benefit to the kids in your family. So it's not a choice between I have to pick and switch back and forth between loving my spouse and loving my kids, but one of the means by which I love my kids is by prioritizing my spouse. And the way that I pour into that relationship is in the way that Ephesians 5 shows us that a marriage is this picture of the gospel, that I am painting a picture of the gospel for my kids every time they see me interacting with their mom. And I think that, and you talk about in your book, the way that having God's perspective on things, you use that term of having God's perspective or the Bible's perspective changes the way that we think about this. And so if we understand that marriage is that gospel picture, that's ultimately the most important thing about marriage, is that it paints that picture, then that actually will begin to shape the way that we treat our spouse. And then it'll actually motivate us to prioritize our spouse rather than we look at, you have a line in the book where you say, without God's perspective, children tend to be idolized if they are adorable or abused if they're not. And I think that's a really helpful idea, because it's once kids become either obstacles or annoyances or and we don't view them as the gifts that God has given us, as they're arrows in our quiver, that they're that they're part of this blessing of what God has given us as a family, that completely transforms everything. And can you kind of unpack what that looks like to have God's perspective on marriage and family?
I perhaps one aspect of it comes to mind, which is affirming the role of a mother. Our society, by and large, some Christian subcultures affirm the role of motherhood, but our secular society, by and large, does not. And one of the things my wife said when we were talking about this question, she said, if I feel loved and valued, it's easier to take the knocks. And if I'm signaling to her that I really value what she's doing, she remembers me saying to her, don't worry that you can't do all these things outside the home because you've got your own congregation there. I mean, so had I, but I was working outside the home as well. And mothers need a lot of affirmation and encouragement because God values the beauty and the dignity of motherhood. And so I think that God's perspective thing comes in there. And I think a husband, forgive me for speaking more as a husband, I mean, that's what I am. So that's what I know in experience. If a husband affirms his wife in her motherhood and encourages her, that's a wonderful thing. Of course, I mean, we mustn't forget that there are significant numbers of couples who would love to have children but can't. And that's a great sadness. And there are all sorts of other questions about that, but that's not the subject of this conversation.
That is excellent, Christopher. Thank you. And I think as we try to take on God's perspective of how we look at our spouses and our kids, I think it's just a reminder that we need to be constantly in God's word ourselves. in God's word with our spouses, and letting God's word be the thing that shapes our families. Because as you said in the past episode and this episode, the world has such a way of shaping the way that we view our families, even unknowingly shaping the way that we view our kids and our spouses. And I think it's just the most important thing in the world to have God's perspective as it's revealed to us in God's word, who we are, who God is, and who our kids are, and how the dynamic of our families are meant to operate according to God's design. And so I think that your answers to those questions are really wonderful, helpful insights that will help us to do that. Well, Christopher, thank you so much for joining us again. It's a privilege and a blessing to have you on the podcast, and I'm sure that as much as I've been helped by this conversation, I think it'll help our parents as well. So thank you.
Good to be with you, Danny.
Thank you for listening today. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, and please check out the show notes below for more resources regarding the topic that we covered today. And be sure to tune in next week when I'll get the chance to ask Danny Shalero, our high school pastor, the question, how do we measure success in student ministry?